You saw the title and thumbnail. Yes, you should use the Death Note. Today we are arguing philosophically that yes, you should absolutely use the Death Note. However, it should only be used under very specific conditions. The question of whether or not someone should use the Death Note is a question of ethical behavior. The question asks simply what you ought to do with the Death Note. Normative ethics is best described as a section of philosophy dedicated to what one ought to do. We'll be skipping agent-based ethics and we'll only be focusing on act-based normative ethics for time's sake. This will be broken down into 3 sections. We'll break down Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, and then we'll discuss the greater implications of social death. So let's get started. Immanuel Kant was an 18th century scholar and philosopher that synthesized the idea of a categorical imperative. Put simply, the categorical imperative is a duty-based ethical system whereby through reason, one can figure out what specific actions one ought to take. It is doing the right thing because it is the right thing to do regardless of impact. The categorical imperative has a few relevant formulations. The first is the universality formulation and the second is the humanity as an ends of itself. The second is slightly more complicated, so let's explain the first one. Imagine for a moment that you were walking in a toy store and you saw something you wanted. Let's say, it's a Goku figure for simplicity's sake. You decide to steal it and take it home with you. The universality principle of the categorical imperative says, imagine if everyone did what you did. Would that make it okay? In this situation, no. The small business would collapse overnight if every time someone went in that store, they stole a Goku figure. The point is that through reason, one can think about every action through this principle. Should I love and cherish my partner? Of course you should, because if everyone did that, the world would be better. Kant has a huge problem with using the magical notebook that ends people's lives. The reason why is that Kantian ethics believes in something called absolute truth. What I mean by this is that Kantian ethics is not an I can justify lying to my brother about whether or not I ate the last slice of pizza type of ethical framework. Kantian ethics believes in a kind of hard rules style system where no action deemed inherently bad can ever be justified. However, many courts in the Western world agree that in very specific cases, certain actions are permissible. So you can probably tell what I'm about to say next. Kant would absolutely disagree with using the Death Note specifically because using it at all violates his perspective on objective morality. To Kant, there is no justifiable way to use the Death Note because in his perspective, there is no way to justify the ending of another human being's life. However, he disagrees for a second reason as well that deals with that second formulation. The second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative is called humanity as an end of itself. Put simply, what he is saying with this one is that no human being should be treated as a stepping stone to get to something else. An example of this would be a situation of general exploitation where someone is being taken advantage of, or a situation where that person is used to get something else. A fun example I like to think of when I think of this formulation is Orochimaru from Naruto. Orochimaru is a ninja obsessed with forbidden jutsu. However, the reason why he is a villain is that he didn't stop with something like fireball jutsu. Instead, he started taking people's bodies. He would quite literally go from person to person inside their bodies like a skin suit. This is what I mean by using people to get what you want. Kant disagrees with this action specifically because he views this as a form of human-based exploitation as an inherently bad thing that can never be justified. This also makes me think about potentially what Kant thinks about a living wage, but Kant died in 1804, so I can't ask him. Unfortunately for Light, he makes it really clear that writing prisoners' names in his magical notebook that ends people's lives is a ploy to become the quote-unquote god of the new world. Light, of course, as previously stated in part 1, genuinely has no idea as to what is wrong with the society and world he lives in. There's global starvation, every ism ever, and like 50 other issues present in the early 2000s. However, this ain't the why Light's decisions with the Death Note make no real sense video. This is the part 2 to that video, so after this video, watch that one for context, nuance, and some funny memes. Also, like and subscribe so I can keep making well-researched video essays. So, with all that being said, Kant fully disagrees with anyone using the magical notebook that ends people's lives for any anything. Not only because if everyone did it, it would be bad, but also because using the Death Note to achieve any goal is inherently bad according to Kant. However, one of the major criticisms of Kantian ethics is that it's really restrictive. As I alluded to earlier, Kantian ethics has a strong belief in objective truth. What this means is that you can't really justify any immoral action with any justification. Lying is always, no matter the situation, inherently bad. Imagine you are a medical professional and you're talking to someone in a critical state and they ask you if they're going to be fine. If you say yes to that person, even if you don't know for sure, Kant is going to say you committed an ethical sin. However, there is an ethical framework that is much less morally restrictive. With Kantian ethics out of the way, we can finally talk about utilitarianism. Before we get started, I just want to say this video is entirely for educational and entertainment purposes, but without further ado, let's get started. Utilitarianism is an ethical framework that primarily operates from the principle, the greatest good for the most amount of people. Generally, this can be interpreted for pleasure or happiness, but they all fit solid in this case. Utilitarian philosophy can be summed up with the very famous trolley problem. Imagine there's someone who decided to be stupid and tie not only themselves to a train track, but 5 other people to an opposite train track. The question as the conductor is, who do you drive the trolley onto? Utilitarianism says drive the trolley onto the single person because 5 people is a greater number than 1. Zack Snyder's Superman says save none of them because he's too busy aura farming in the sun. I haven't seen the new James Gunn Superman, but tell me if it's decent in the comments. Ultimately, utilitarianism believes that you can indeed reason right from wrong. However, utilitarianism differs from Kantian ethics in that you can very easily justify immoral actions. The reason why is that utilitarianism is a type of consequentialist philosophy, which means that good and bad are simply calculated entirely by how many people are harmed and how badly they were harmed and vice versa. So imagine a firefighter rushing into a burning building. He chooses the children to carry out first because he can carry more of them. Before the building collapses, he manages to save 3 children, but their parents perish. Despite 2 adult human beings perishing, the fact that he was able to save 3 kids makes that choice ultimately the correct one. Whether the state is going to take care of those kids is probably a decent question to ask after this point, because I hear the adoption system isn't all that great in America. Regardless, you see what I'm getting at here, right? All we have to do is prove that the happiness gained is greater than the unquantifiably immoral action of taking a human life. Now, without further ado, let's see the reason why you should potentially use the Death Note. Let's talk for a moment about insulin. Insulin was discovered in 1921 by Sir Frederick G. Banting, Charles H. Best, and J.J.R. McLeod, I think, at the University of Toronto. They discovered that insulin was able to lower the blood sugar levels of people experiencing diabetes. This revolutionary medical technology was sold as a patent for $1. For those already in the know, you already know where I'm going with this take. Writing someone's name in a magical notebook that takes people's lives isn't the only way to end a life. In the real world, there are multiple ways to end someone's life indirectly. One of those methods is to make a life-saving medicine extremely expensive. Approximately 38.4 million Americans have diabetes, and not all of them can afford the price hikes in insulin prices. In a mode of production where the profit motive is king, it isn't just Eli Lilly, Nordisk, and Sanofi that are responsible for deaths caused as a consequence of profit seeking. Some of these deaths may not be as immediate as Light Yagami's victims, but they are real and they are everywhere. Every poor person that dies of heart failure as a consequence of not having access to nutritious food is a direct result of choices either made by politicians or by people who fund them. This, in essence, is called a social death. The major corporations that rule people's lives will never go to prison for laying waste to entire populations as a consequence of these social deaths. There is no reason why, in a country full of vacant lots and vacant homes, there should ever be a homeless person for any reason. The fact that there is a such thing as a homeless person should disgust everyone. However, we act like they aren't there and come up with 50 million reasons why apparently we wouldn't be in the same position if we missed more than 3 checks in a row. The story of Death Note takes place generally in the early 2000s. In 2007, Japan had 18,564 homeless people. Of course, these numbers don't account for the thousands of people living in capsule hotels, cafes, and housing without amenities. A 2025 article from the Examiner estimated that there may be as many as 100,000 to 200,000 homeless people based on these factors. My point is that the magical notebook that ends people's lives could definitely be used better in more socially aware hands. Let's go through a few use cases. One could find a way to raise the minimum wage to $23 in every Western nation. One could cease wars and that thing Starbucks didn't let their union talk about that one time. One could even give women their reproductive rights in every country on the face of this planet. So, could you make an argument for Mario broing the world into a much more decent place to live? Yeah, you probably could. However, I want everyone watching this video to realize something important. This world is messed up because there are several power structures and social inequalities that must be dismantled. There is no magical solution that gets the world fixed in a day. People have to come together and organize in their communities so that things actually change. Therefore, there is no changing the world without going outside, getting to know your neighbors, and doing what you can. Learning how to go outside and simply engage with your community instead of debate broing inside a Discord or a Twitch chat is hard. I've been there. However, climate change is here and the issues that plagued our grandparents and our parents are still here. Hate is alive and well in the world, and there is no magical notebook that is just going to solve these global problems. If we notice that children are starving, we have to organize and come together to feed them and agitate against the structures of society that are starving those children in the first place. At the end of the day, do what you can, even if it's just volunteering at a soup kitchen on Sundays or even just talking to your family. You don't even have to be an abled person to help make the world a better place. I haven't seen the new Superman movie, but I bet it's about how Superman is actually a symbol of hope and justice in a world that feels like it was made without both. So let's get into the conclusion. So funny story, I actually made these two videos over the course of multiple months, and I didn't want to even start editing this video because I felt like I left it on such a relatively down note. After reading the script, I realized I actually had more to say, so I ended up changing it after I watched the new James Gunn Superman. What people get wrong about Superman is that his greatest strength feat isn't lifting a book that has infinite pages, it's being a defiantly empathetic person in a world dead set on convincing everyone that empathy and compassion have gone out of style. It's sincerely caring deeply for the people he loves in the city he protects. The message of this video is that sometimes you don't need a complex ethical system to do the right thing. Sometimes you just have to open your heart and feel compassion and empathy towards those suffering systemic injustice and then go do something about it. If the Kantian part of this video was the thesis and the utilitarian part of the video was the antithesis, allow me to introduce to you the synthesis of this video. I want to start this section by reinforcing everything I said in the previous section. You absolutely still do need to go outside and serve your community while advocating for a better tomorrow. That part I don't think was a miss, but what was missing on the original script was something huge in my opinion. I forgot to communicate the fact that having a complex moral framework to guide your ethical behavior genuinely isn't necessary. I used Kantian ethics and utilitarianism as an interesting dichotomy to explain the two perspectives on the nature of society. However, I forgot to explain that this isn't necessary at all. This school of thought is called the feminist ethics of care. After the civil rights movement and the 70s social justice wave, feminists and environmentalists in the 80s and 90s began producing a lot of theoretical works. Out of this theoretical tradition, many scholars and groups like the River Combahee Collective, Bell Hooks, and Carol Gilligan were produced. Gilligan is the one who synthesized the idea of ethics of care. Her work critiques the fact that as a consequence of socialization, we collectively think of empathy and compassion as feminine traits and therefore undervalue them in society. Ultimately, this branch of philosophy, to my knowledge, critiques traditional patriarchy for masculinizing the way we interact with other people. She advocates for people to be empathetic and compassionate to other people instead of using complex moral frameworks because in this view, they may not be entirely necessary. Imagine you're walking in a calm and quiet neighborhood and you feel the sun on your skin and the wind in your hair. Yet you see a child who is wincing in pain after falling off their bike. A complex moral system isn't required to know what to do in this scenario. You don't need to think about the categorical imperative to help a child. Even if you don't know the child, you don't have to ask if they're okay. You can just hand them $5 and they will just feel better. There's actually a million things you could do in this scenario, but I bet your heart is actually saying to do something at least to help that child feel better. This basic emotion is called empathy. This core fundamental emotion is extremely important to understanding the question that spawned this video. This video's basic premise is about whether or not one should actually use the Deathnote. But what it's really about is what kinds of actions are necessary to bring out social change. Ultimately, the answer to this question is basically a really hard maybe. One could always justify using an object like that with theoretical net positives, but that doesn't really necessarily help any of the victims of social inequalities. What's necessary for social change is being more like Superman and less like Light Yagami. What this means in practice is directly aiding those being left behind in our world and seeing what you can do to help. Like I said, soup kitchens are always looking for volunteers, and spending time at a non-for-profit you know you can trust that actually does good work is always a good thing. Donating money to good causes is usually helpful as well. So with all of this in mind, individual action isn't the name of the game when it comes to social change. Therefore, the only way to find the light out of the darkness is to extend a helping hand. Ultimately, at the end of the day, Rome wasn't built in a day, and it certainly wasn't built by one person. If a better tomorrow is the end goal, then as many people as there are stars in the sky will have to be necessary to reach a new dawn. If you can do something, you should do something, not only because you reasoned it was the right thing to do, but because you feel empathy for those in harm's way. Hi, thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. I know things got a little serious towards the end, but I tried to make it a hopeful conclusion. I'll try to keep it relatively light in the next one. The next video is a breakdown between the two perspectives of Gojo and Geto on the nature of Jujutsu Society, contrasted with the two perspectives of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. This is my second ever video on YouTube, and I wanted to be a creator on this platform for a really long time, so I hope you genuinely enjoyed this video. However, for those who can support me on Patreon, please do so. I plan on making videos like this for a really long time, so I would love to be able to make this my full-time job. Once again, all sources are in the comment section and links are in the description. If you enjoyed this video or like deep breakdowns of history, philosophy, and culture, check out the previous video to see a breakdown of the cultural elements that produce the story of Deathnote.
Problem was they kept discovering new ones.
Check this out. Shit is funny as hell. Let's do this.
So the first beat tapes I heard, when I first heard that stuff, I didn't even know anybody was doing stuff like that, you know, especially where he's from also.
Let's run the tape. Okay. Let's do this.